the number one thing people around the world want from their leaders is hope.
Every relationship in life has an emotional bank account, and you make deposits and you make withdrawals. And we all know what happens if you take more out of an account than you've deposited, you end up overdrawn. We're in the insurance industry, Bernie. We pay people for doing things that go against common sense.
Health, fitness, career, relationships, and legacy. Every aspect of our humanity is somewhere in those 5 pillars.
When we talk about wellness, we're talking about people automatically go to physical wellness, but there's a huge mental component to that. People are battling demons that you'll never know in the workplace. If we are just willing to sit and listen with the intent to understand as opposed to the intent to respond, we are going to learn things from the generation coming in that will help us perpetuate our business for the foreseeable future.
A leader's responsibility doesn't include managing employees' health, except what I'm suggesting in the fulfillment-centric leadership framework is simply call attention to the importance of managing your health.
After you graduate from college, your transcript doesn't matter anymore. Probably after your first job, your transcript doesn't matter, if they even look at that these days. Because everybody thinks that you can just slap a bunch of content out on the internet these days with ChatGPT. And my challenge to them is, how embarrassing is it going to be when someone actually has the voice of that content resonate with them, picks up the phone to call you, only to find out it's not the same voice? What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Power Producers Podcast. And I have to tell you, this is going to be a very special episode. And I know I say that quite a bit, but this one really is, because we have a longtime friend and mentor of mine, Mr. Bernie Borges, as our guest. And if you have been with us since the very beginning, you already know who he is. So we are going to dive in with Bernie and find out where he's been for the last few years, because I know he's been busy. He has got his Midlife Fulfilled podcast, and he also has a new leadership program that he has developed, and we are going to dive deep into that today. So without wasting any more time or breath, welcome, Bernie.
Thank you, David. It is an honor to be back with you on your amazing producers podcast.
Well, thanks, man. You know, it's interesting because a lot of people in the insurance industry at this point, know who I am and kind of what I do. But what they probably don't know is that none of this would ever exist if I hadn't bought a certain book a few years back. Like, I can't even believe, man, it's got to be almost 20 years ago now that you wrote Marketing 2.0.
It's approaching that. It was 2009 that it
Good
published.
grief.
Yeah. And David, I'll never forget, you and I met over, I think it was breakfast, and you brought your copy of your book, and it was, to say it was dog-eared, to say that there were notes in it is an understatement. You probably are the most prolific in really sinking your teeth into it and then executing on it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, though, because and I'm not just saying this because you're on the podcast. I'm telling you because you're here. But I mean, I really do go back and look at a lot of the things that you talk about in that book. I mean, I still have it. I still go back and refer to it. And what's interesting to me is, even though platforms and delivery mechanisms and distribution have changed, a lot of the principles have not.
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the things that's an area of danger for a lot of people in the marketing game today. And maybe not necessarily, professional marketers who have digital marketing companies or formal education around it, but people who are trying to build that online brand presence, and they see AI and they see the ability to automate a lot of this stuff. And I would caution anybody listening to this, because I'm a huge proponent of online marketing, obviously, and what we used to call social media marketing, which is transformed into digital. But the key to making that work is authenticity and consistency. And that can't happen when you're outsourcing that or automating it. It really has to be you. And so when I bring even somebody in to work with them as a producer inside of Killing Commercial or Power Producer Basecamp, that's one of the things I talk to them about, because everybody thinks that you can just slap a bunch of content out on the internet these days with ChatGPT. And my challenge to them is, how embarrassing is it going to be when someone actually has the voice of that content resonate with them, picks up the phone to call you, only to find out it's not the same voice,
Right.
because you automatically generated it. So I will tell you that some of the principles, many of the principles that you talked about in Marketing 2.0 will stand the test of time because it's all about human relationships, just a different way to nurture and develop those. So I will
Exactly.
forever be grateful for you reading that book. And I think there's probably a lot of people out there listening to this that are also grateful for you reading that book because it's led to so many things, including this podcast. I've now written 2 books with a third on the way. And we, all of the other things that we do. And I give you all the credit in the world for helping get me started on this journey and giving me a thirst to want to know more and just constantly challenging the status quo and learning and adapting. So thank you for that.
Well, that's incredibly humbling. And I congratulate you, David, for really just, again, executing with authenticity to the max. So
I tell people all the time when I speak, I'm a social swinger. I'll connect with you on any platform, but you have to be ready to get what I'm willing to give. And what you get is exactly who we are. If you're on Facebook and you see things about my family, if you meet them, they are exactly what you see on Facebook. And to be honest with you, that's the greatest compliment that I get. I've traveled the country the last several years doing keynote speaking at different conferences and things. And every single time I come off stage and start mingling with the people who have heard me, they tell me, you are absolutely no different than the person we see online. And I said, I'm a big dumb animal. I'm really not smart enough to be two different people. But the reality is, I want you to connect with me for who I am, because that connection means something. I can't be fake and have you connect with that person, or you'll see through it right away.
exactly. Yep.
So we
Amen to
talked.
that.
Yeah, we don't want. I mean, we could camp out on this all day, but I mean, you've got some exciting stuff going on, and I'm anxious to hear it. And to be honest with you, for everybody listening, Bernie and I were chatting a little bit, just getting caught up a little bit on what's going on with his family and everything else before I hit that record button and did the intro. But I told him right before I did, I want my questions to be naturally curious and authentic. So I'm going to listen to what he has going on, and none of this stuff is canned. Typically it isn't, but I really don't know which direction he's headed and what he's doing. So I think this is going to be a pretty amazing podcast as a result. If I'm any good at all at asking questions, we are all in for a treat.
All right. Well, David, where would you like to start?
Why don't you kind of give us the overview and how you've migrated sort of out of this very well-known marketing mind inside the Tampa Bay area to now sort of, you've had your midlife mindfulness, right?
Midlife Fulfilled.
Midlife Fulfilled, sorry. Midlife Fulfilled podcast, and that's got a couple hundred episodes. And then now you've moved into kind of this leadership framework consultancy that I'm anxious to hear about. And I think there are a lot of agencies out there that would benefit from hearing what you have to say and hopefully, reach out to engage.
Sure. So I think, David, that I've been podcasting for a while, since 2013, so almost 15 years. And so I was in between podcast shows in 2021, and I didn't want to do another marketing podcast. My first 2 were marketing podcasts. The second one I retired at episode 300. So I decided that I wanted to do a podcast about midlife, and I didn't know exactly what. And I did a bunch of research, and I settled on the theme of fulfillment, because when I was doing my research, David, I saw that most of the midlife podcasts were hosted by women and discussing women topics. And that's great. But I didn't find anybody talking about fulfillment. I did come across people talking about happiness, and that kind of took me down another rabbit hole, which the outcome of that was I really learned that there's a significant difference between happiness and fulfillment. And fulfillment is much deeper than happiness. Happiness is an emotion. It can be fleeting. Fulfillment is deeper. It's typically associated with some kind of an achievement, whether it's small or medium sized or big. And the one thing about fulfillment is that it is usually immutable, meaning when you're fulfilled about anything, almost nothing can take that away. So 222 episodes at the time of you and I doing this recording, 3 years, Midlife Fulfilled podcast. It's been sort of a master's degree in all things fulfillment in midlife. And it's enabled me to build a platform on what I call the 5 key life pillars. And the 5 key life pillars are health, fitness, career, relationships, and legacy. Every aspect of our humanity is somewhere in those 5 pillars. I'm often asked, I'm a person of faith, and I've had people of faith ask me, so Bernie, where's faith or religion, whatever you want to call it in there?
In full transparency, in my mind, before you ever said that, the first thing
Yeah.
that I thought of, wait a minute, Bernie doesn't have faith in there, so where does he have it in the mix? Because I know you personally well enough to know that it's in the mix, but that's literally the first thing that I thought when I heard you list it.
Yeah. Common question. It's in relationship. It's in the relationship pillar. The relationship pillar is humongous. It's not only a relationship with people, which it can span work, outside of work, family, etc. But if you're a person of faith, that is a relationship. So the point is that this podcast has given me tremendous insights that have enabled me to develop this platform. I tested this platform, the midlife, the 5 pillars, and even the early stages of the framework, the leadership framework that I'll share with you at a keynote that I delivered in 2023, October 2023, at the University of Notre Dame. They have a program called the Inspired Leadership Initiative. They invited me to be the keynote speaker. They were a sponsor for my podcast in 2023. And I tested this. And by the way, they asked that very same question.
Can't imagine why.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Notre Dame. And it was very well received. And then late last year, I presented my framework, my fulfillment-centric leadership framework, at a virtual summit. So virtual, obviously, it's a Zoom style presentation. I had 230 people attend my session. It was NSLS, National Society for Leadership and Success. You can see why they go by NSLS, right? It's a mouthful. And I was one of 12 speakers, 230 people in my room. And David, I was the number 1 rated speaker with a score of 4.7 out of 5. I don't say that to say, wow, great speaker. It was, I think, the content. So the framework basically is a simple premise. And get this premise: employees give you their best work when they're personally and professionally fulfilled. And it addresses a humongous problem. And the problem is very well documented by Gallup. In their 2024 State of Workplace report, Gallup says that 77% of the global workforce is disengaged. The global cost to the economy is $8.9 trillion in lost productivity. So again, 77% of the global workforce is disengaged. So I'm over here saying, I think the solution to that is empower leaders to make their employees, not make their employees, but to enable their employees to be both personally and professionally fulfilled. So I've developed a framework that I call the Fulfillment-Centric Leadership Framework. There are 10 steps, and I'm actually packaging those 10 steps into 3 sort of stages so that it's a little bit more, the number 3 is a little bit more palatable than 10, but the 10 steps are sort of integrated. They are integrated into those 3 phases. And it begins with step number 1 is self-awareness. Leaders need to first look at their own life and ask the following question 5 times. How fulfilled am I in health, which is physical and mental? How fulfilled am I in my fitness? How fulfilled am I in my career, in my relationships, and in my legacy quest? And they need to really do an authentic self-assessment, because then they begin the journey of being equipped to lead their people through that same lens, because everybody that is on their team is going through the exact same journey. And so, I'm not going to walk through all the 10 steps here with you. I'm certainly happy to unpack anything you want to unpack. But the point is that when leaders lead intentionally, I actually call this a conscious, competent approach. I'll give you one other part of this story, David, because I've shared with you that the last 3 years have really given me all the insights to develop this framework. But there's actually something that happened to me way back in 1990 that was the beginning of this journey. I didn't realize it until I did a bunch of self-reflection. So 1990, I'm a youngster. I'm in my first leadership role. And tragically, one of the 8 people on my team was killed in a domestic violence incident, a young lady. You can just imagine how devastating that was to us. So what I learned was that I learned the difference between managing and leading, because we obviously, took some time to grieve, but we were within a company. It wasn't my company. We were within a software company, technology company. We still had to get the work done, like that didn't go away. So managing, getting the work done, I realized like that was one aspect of my responsibility, but I also realized that I needed to lead them as people. So I simply just started to get to know them more intimately, so to speak, just get to know them as people. And I took that mindset with me beyond that company into other leadership roles throughout my career, but it was an unconscious, competent approach. You can't go across the world and say to your leaders, hey, lead your people holistically as people so that they're personally and professionally fulfilled. Some might be able to do it through unconscious competence, but how is everybody else going to do it? So this framework, this 10-step framework, is exactly that. It's a framework that equips leaders with the conscious competence to lead their people to be both personally and professionally fulfilled. And the business benefit, by the way, is should be obvious, right? More engaged, more loyal, more productive. And hopefully more productive means your business is growing if your employees are engaged. So that's kind of the big picture overview.
So as you were describing the self-awareness thing, I think that I can safely say that I believe all of us at some point in our careers have worked with someone or for someone who is in a leadership role that probably isn't as self-aware as what they think they are. And, I think that there's some danger in handing somebody any kind of an assessment without some explicit instruction for what that means as you drill down. So I'm under the assumption that when you have these people ask how fulfilled am I in each of these 5 areas, there has to be some definition around what you mean by that before they go and start saying that, because a lot of people probably think, oh yeah, I'm fulfilled at work. Well, what does that really mean? What does it mean to be really fulfilled? What are the things you're taking into consideration as you think through what your answer to that question is going to be? So, I mean, I understand, obviously, we don't want to unpack all of this, but I mean, how deep do you go to really challenge these people to think deep and be, the most self-aware they possibly can be? Because I think everybody on the surface thinks, oh yeah, I'm pretty self-aware. I know what people perceive me to be. I know how I think about myself and everything else, when the reality is it's probably not anywhere near as accurate as you think it is.
Yeah, not surprised, David, that you got right to the heart of an issue, an important issue on this whole topic. So when I do this in a workshop environment for either a client or maybe a public setting, which is typically a half day, sometimes a full day, then there's more time to be able to get into exercises so people can experience the exercise. When I'm delivering this in more of a, if you want to call it a keynote or a breakout session, whatever, it's call it 30 to 45 minutes, it's a little more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
I still am going to explain that fulfillment is something that we as humans, we value fulfillment more than we do happiness. And I'll give you a data point from my Thriving in Midlife research report that I published last year. This is a 157-page report that's available on my website at midlifefulfilled.com, and it's free. It's a free download, although that might change someday. One of the data points is we asked, if you could only be fulfilled or happy, which would you choose? And we put a definition to happiness and fulfillment so that there was context for the people who took the survey. And the survey was anonymous. I believe you might have taken the survey. I wouldn't know because I didn't ask for a name and an email address, but I know that I put it on your radar. And this was a while ago, like close to a year ago. And David, almost 80% chose fulfillment. And here's another data point that illustrates the meaning of fulfillment. 61% said that they're highly fulfilled in their career, but 75% said that they're highly satisfied in their career. So there's a higher percentage who said they're satisfied and a lower percentage who said they're fulfilled, because fulfillment is a higher bar. So again, whether if I'm doing it in a more of a keynote, then I really I have to get that point across in a shorter amount of time. When I have the luxury of a workshop setting, there's exercises, and I ask people to literally answer that question for themselves. How fulfilled are you in each of those pillars? And whether they're willing to share it or not, at least do go through that exercise authentically. And then the next step is for them to align their values with those pillars. And that's another very personal exercise, David, right? It's like, what are your current values? Before we press record, you were talking about how you recently took, an amazing vacation with your family. That is clearly one of your values, is spending quality time with your loved ones, right? So aligning your values, and that's one of your values. I know you have, many values. Aligning your values with where you currently are fulfilled and unfulfilled. For a lot of people, David, that is an immediate wake up call. Like this light bulb goes off that goes, whoa, there's a disconnect between this value and that value and where I'm currently not fulfilled. And so, again, the more leaders are self aware of this, the more equipped they are to then lead their teams through that lens of fulfillment. But there's other aspects too where they need to pull HR and get HR involved as well, or HR equivalent in smaller companies, because a leader's responsibility doesn't include managing employees' health, except what I'm suggesting in the fulfillment-centric leadership framework is simply call attention to the importance of managing your health. The last thing that we want is an employee who is ignoring their health, and one Monday they call in sick and you just think, oh, they have the flu. And then they tell you a couple of days later that no, they had a diagnosis and they should have gone for tests 3 years ago and they didn't. And now they've got a diagnosis and they might be out indefinitely, which is obviously not good for the employee and it's not good for your business because they weren't managing their health. So it's not our job to manage their health, but certainly we serve them and serve our business by encouraging people to manage their health and offer them resources to
Well, I
do
think
so.
honestly, man, I think that this plays into a lot of the wellness movement that we see with a lot of the commercial clients that I deal with on, Florida Risk Partners, because with the introduction and adoption of wearables, where you can record heart rate and sleep activity and, even stress levels or whatever. Like I wear this 24/7, 365. If I take this Whoop off, it tells me you need to put it back on. I know it's not on your wrist anymore and you're not going to have accurate data. But employers and I'm saying this and I want to be very, very clear. I'm not necessarily saying this because it's my own belief structure, but we are in a capitalist society and people do look at the almighty dollar. And it's in their best interest to have a healthy workforce because of the employee benefits costs that they'll save as a result of that. And, I don't think that a lot of times we do a good job of framing that message. But if you do, let's just walk down the road for a split second. If you do have a focus on the wellness of your employees and a fulfillment in their health, it is going to be a profitable endeavor for a business as well, because not only are you going to get greater productivity, better attendance, but you're going to save money on one of the largest costs that every employer who provides employee benefits has, which is their health insurance. So I say that because there are a lot of people in leadership that are not going to, they're not necessarily touchy feely. They're going to run, they're old school. They're going to, run it like it's, a drill sergeant in the military or whatever. And they just don't get that there's a bigger picture than the dollar that can really, if they work on that over there, they're automatically going to increase their profitability. But if all they're focusing on is their profitability, it's still a really good decision for them.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. Especially with the rise of AI, we're using more and more technology, and we need to know where technology has its role, its place, and then where people, human beings, have their role and their place. And simply stated, I say that I have a common sense solution to the problem of 77% of the employee workforce is disengaged. So I think it is a common sense solution. When employees are personally and professionally fulfilled, they give you their best work. The problem is that common sense does not necessarily live all that commonly everywhere in every business. And that may offend some people, but I'm not going to worry about offending people. That's just the reality.
I think everybody that listens to this podcast can pretty much say they would agree with that statement. We deal with it every day. We're in the insurance industry, Bernie. We pay people for doing things that go against common sense.
Yeah.
very few claims happen because of something common sense. Usually, it's more like the Darwin Awards where, they did something, we have a saying in the industry, insurance does pay for stupid too, and so it's not excluded from the policy.
Yeah, yeah. I want to take you down to step 9 out of 10 because it's a key one. I keep harping on fulfillment and the how fulfillment is very, very meaningful to us as human beings. And one of the things that I think doesn't happen in the workplace is enough opportunity for employees to experience fulfillment. Fulfillment is typically associated with achievement. And just look at your own life. You can have small achievements like, hey, I got to the gym 3 times this week. That could be a small achievement that feels good. You're fulfilled about that, right? And then you can have a big fulfillment tied to something big, a project, whatever it may be. So, providing employees with more opportunity for achievement equals more fulfillment. So, step number 9 is encouraging leaders to structure work activity. I'm using that as a generic expression, work activity in 3 levels of complexity: low, medium, and high. Now, if you want to label it something else, whatever, label it whatever you want to label it. For discussion purposes, I'm just going to call it low, medium, and high. And with low, and by the way, acknowledge, recognize, and just give it a little recognition for those low achievements. I mean, a simple example could be maybe a monthly report. That's sure it's a part of the person's job, but how many of us, I've been there where I submit my report and it goes into a black hole. I never hear a word about it. We've all experienced that. And I'm just using a report as an example. By structuring work activity into 3 levels of complexity, low, medium, and high, or whatever you choose to call it, you give employees an opportunity to experience achievement more often. And as long as it gets recognized, even in a small way, it gives employees simply that validation and the value that they feel, which is also synonymous with fulfillment. I call that the money step, David, because in too many organizations, both the achievements are usually long term. They're big projects. In sales, it could be an annual quota, and in other scenarios, it could be something quarterly or a couple of times a year that achievement is experienced. And there's not enough achievement that is experienced, although there could be. The example that I use is when we went to college, we don't just hang our hat on the fact that we graduated and got our degree. I mean, of course, that's the ultimate, that's the culmination of fulfillment. But what about every semester along the way? What about when you passed that chemistry class and you hated every minute of it, but you passed it? That was an achievement, and you can have a sense of fulfillment from that. What about that time in debate class where you had an awesome debate against the top debater or whatever? I'm just making stuff up where there's all these little
Yeah, or
achievements.
even from a social aspect. What about the time that you went on a spring break trip with your friends? I mean, I realize it doesn't translate to academics, but I have to believe that it translates to fulfillment because that's part of that experience. And it's interesting because I don't remember which book it was. It was either Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell or one of his, or it was one of the Freakonomics books. But they talked about Fortune 500 CEOs and how the average Fortune 500 CEO was only a C student in college. And the reason why is because they enjoyed the ride. They weren't so focused on academics that they lost out on the social experiences. And because they found, and I would argue, fulfillment in the social experiences, it propelled them in their career because it wasn't that they weren't intelligent, right? It was just they didn't apply themselves to the academics only. And because they knew how to relate to people, it made them better leaders when they got into the real world. Because at some point after you graduate from college, your transcript doesn't matter anymore. Probably after your first job, your transcript doesn't matter if they even look at that these days. It's going to be based on your performance, your skill set, how you lead and inspire other people. And I think too many times, and this is something that I've very consciously paid attention to with my own children in terms of their learning experience and how they progress through life, you have to kind of take everything in. You can't just focus on the one thing, or you're going to find out you're going to wake up one day and you're missing things in your life.
Exactly. What this whole experience that I've been going through these last 3+ years is what it's done for me is simply heightened my awareness for the influence of fulfillment in our life. And I'm simply taking that out to business by saying, hey, we've got a problem out here. 77% of the workforce is disengaged. $8.9 trillion cost, annual cost and lost productivity. Let's apply a little common sense here and let's give leaders the ability to lead their people so that they feel both personally and professionally fulfilled. And pretty good chance that's going to put a dent in that 77% number. And if it does, and when it does, then that should give us a boost in productivity, which equals growth, revenue, profit, everything that, businesses need and want. So that's really, and look, this is a passion of mine that I've turned into a business through keynote speaking, workshop, that kind of thing. Some executive coaching along the way, but it's awesome, David, to do this at this phase of my life and career, to apply this passion in a business. And I know you've been doing that for a long, long time. Your passion for supporting, the insurance agencies, and you do it with passion and authenticity. So that's what I'm doing here.
I think the message has to be well received, though, because I do think that we're at a point right now where the workforce itself has changed. Um, and I say that because I hire people and I see what the values are that are, or the value that are placed on things from the people coming in that are the younger generation. Now, I'm the oldest person in my firm by a landslide, nobody even close. And it's not that it was necessarily intentional that way, but I think what I've been able to do is give people who are younger a safe space to be themselves and have a say in what goes on. And I'm probably at the tail end of the generation that was so worried about controlling everything and making sure it's my way or the highway or whatever. I just realized that I had to shift relatively quickly in thought process because it is a much different skill set to lead a group of early 20s people today than it was when I was running grocery stores back in the early and mid 90s. That was a completely different management slash leadership. I wouldn't even call it leadership. It was management.
Mm-hmm.
But to be where we're at today, you have to be able to adapt and understand that it's not always going to be the status quo. And to a certain degree, I find it to be refreshing that when you bring younger people into your organization, it's not always about the money. It's about what are you doing in the community or what are you doing to make the world a better place? How does the company invest its resources there? What are you doing for me for self-development so that I can become better at what I'm doing and be a better human being overall? Not necessarily just, training for your skill set in your job. It's investing in them as human beings to make them the best they can be and reach their potential there. And the other thing is, and I say this all the time because I'm in an industry that is very difficult to change. It's like trying to turn a cruise ship. It's going to take time and effort to make that happen, but we have to get beyond control and move into collaboration, because if we are just willing to sit and listen with the intent to understand as opposed to the intent to respond, we are going to learn things from the generation coming in that will help us perpetuate our business for the foreseeable future. But if we shut down and think that we know best and it's the only way to do things, we're going to be dinosaurs and eventually go extinct because they're going to go to a place that's willing to give them a seat at the table, that's willing to listen to what they have to say, that's willing to invest in making them better, complete people, that's investing in the community and giving them an opportunity to serve so that they feel like they're part of something more than just a job at that point.
And all of that comes back to fulfillment, David. They may not use that word. They may not use that word.
No, but
But
you can surmise that from what they say, right? It's
exactly.
basically they're telling you that in different ways.
Exactly. I'll give you another synonym for fulfillment. I just came across this study from Gallup. They do these amazing studies and they do them to the tune of thousands and thousands of, input data points, and they do them globally. And this report shows that the number one thing that people want from their leaders, and leaders is defined very broadly. It's not just a boss in the workplace. It's whoever is leading them. So it doesn't have to be the workplace. So it could include family, but a lot of it is, of course, the workplace. The number one thing that people said globally they want from their leaders, this is going to shock you, but to me, it's a synonym for fulfillment. It's not the word fulfillment, but it's a synonym for it. the number one thing people around the world want from their leaders is hope. Hope. That speaks to their soul, their humanity.
Yeah, it would be an interesting exercise to ask people when you say the word hope, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? What does that mean to you? Because I think you'd get a lot of different answers.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know what? I think they'll all come back to the point that I just made, that it's all about their humanity,
100%.
because they didn't say I want a raise or another title or I want to work from home. you know,
Right.
they said number one thing they want is hope. So, however they define it, it's going to be tied to their humanity. And you said it earlier in this conversation. We're at a point in time and in society now where the workplace really needs to recognize, and in many ways it is, the wellness component of employees.
And I'll tell you, one of the things, I mean, obviously, when we were talking about it in the context of this conversation, it was physical wellness, but there's a big push for mental wellness in the community, as in the workforce as well.
Yep.
I'm actually working with a group right now out in Arizona that reached out to me for some help on insurance and risk management stuff, as they're establishing a nonprofit that is a suicide prevention. It's for suicide prevention specific to the construction industry. Now, number one, I didn't realize that there was even a problem with suicide in the construction industry. Number two, of all of the industries that you would think people would recognize something like that and then want to try and solve the problem, construction's probably not going to be at the top of my list. You're thinking of, you know, grizzled veterans swinging hammers and everything else. And I just have been very intrigued in listening to the statistics and all of the things that they were doing to educate me about what a real problem that this is inside the construction industry. So much so that the guy's so passionate about it that he's created a nonprofit to help these people because it's a chronic issue. And I think a lot of times when we talk about wellness, we're talking about people automatically go to physical wellness, but there's a huge mental component to that. People are battling demons that you'll never know in the workplace. And many times we're not allowed to ask about just because of how the laws are. But you can be safe to say that if you have, a workforce of a reasonable number of people, that you've got a decent percentage of them that are dealing with something that you probably don't even know about. And it makes it difficult as a leader to navigate, because I'm a pretty direct person, as I'm sure you know. I'd rather just ask you the question and get the answer, like, hey, what's going on? I notice things aren't right. What are you struggling with? Because I feel like something's happening outside of work that's affecting your performance here. Probably would get myself in trouble by asking that question. But at the same time, we have to hold people accountable to performance when they're here. So it's interesting to think about the balance between what our expectations are versus the battles that people may be facing, and then how we bridge that gap as compassionate employers and leaders to help them get the tools and the resources that they need to get themselves where they need to be or where they want to be. And I'd say that because I don't want people to think that wellness focuses solely on physical wellness, because the physical is easy to surmise and see. Like, if somebody's overweight, you can tell they're overweight, right? Like, I walked around carrying 100 extra pounds for a long time. Pretty obvious that I was doing that. It was also really obvious when I dropped it. But if I was struggling with alcoholism, you may not see that. Or if I was addicted to something else, you may not see that addiction. It may manifest itself in performance, but you're not going to know exactly what it is that's driving that. And I think it's a tough gap as an employer to bridge, especially if you're talking about small to middle-sized companies that don't have the dedicated HR in-house, and so you're having to navigate those waters on your own. And I say that because I think that a lot of times people miss the mental part of it.
I agree. And at the risk of oversimplifying it, which is not what I want to do, because it's a serious subject that really warrants serious attention. But at the risk of oversimplifying it, sometimes just acknowledging it to your point, having a conversation with an employee and just saying, is there anything that I can do to support you? Is there anything that you might be struggling with? And we can explore ways to support, you know, just acknowledging it can be a great first step, because then the individual can then begin to feel like you are speaking to their humanity. I know I've said that a lot of times in this conversation, but it comes back to this entire co- concept of personal and professional fulfillment.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, man, but there are certain things that I've figured out over the course of my career, and some of them I've been very fortunate to have figured out at a pretty early age because I was thrust into a position that, quite frankly, I probably had no business being in, and so I had to basically fall back on my own core values and who I was as a person to determine how I was going to be a servant leader in my organization. And I know I said it tongue in cheek about, being in the grocery industry was more about management than it was leadership, but that was also a little bit self-deprecating because I am going to pat myself on the back and say that at 22 years old, I inherited a $16 million a year business and was told to figure out how to run it. And I had complete responsibility from P&L to human resources to inventory control and all of the things that go with that. And so one of the things that I learned very, very quickly, it came from a bad experience, and that was turnover. Turnover is a nasty thing inside of any industry, and when your labor pool that you're pulling people from is really not that deep, you need to hold on to the people that you have. And I went in, it is a very short-tempered 22-year-old, the day before Thanksgiving, the single biggest shopping day of the year, and I fired my entire stock crew at 4 o'clock in the morning with 22 pallets of groceries on the floor. And it was an emotional decision. It was not probably well thought out, but I was angry and I was ready to start over fresh, and basically was able to take what probably could have been one of the most negative experiences in my career and turned it into a positive because we ended up building a really good culture after that. The reality was the people needed to be terminated. The other reality is probably not the best timing to do it, but as the department heads started to come in and set up their departments, before they ever went to their own department, they were to go and help stock the store. And when the store was officially stocked and cleaned up, then we took all of the department heads and helped everybody open their departments across the store in a wave so that the store was still open and ready for business at 8 o'clock in the morning. What I took from that was I probably could have avoided having to do what I did if I would have paid more time and attention into investing in those people and understanding their perspective and where they came from. And I would argue they could have done the same, but I needed to be the one to initiate that conversation because when you're in that kind of a role, you're automatically assumed to be a certain persona, whether you are or you aren't. And so from that time forward, the biggest impact that I could make in my store was, number one, realizing I can't do this by myself. I need everybody in here to do this. Even though I was young and aggressive and cocky and thought that I could, I had to humble myself quickly and realize that. The second thing that I did was I devoted the first 2 hours of every single day to simply walking around and talking to the people. And you can learn so much by just simply saying, "Hey, how are you? How are things going?" And that's it. And you just shut up and you listen. A lot of people in that environment don't have other people to talk to. And I ended up hearing stories that would absolutely blow your mind if you knew that. But it made me a better leader. It made me a better person. And the other thing that it did is it completely squashed turnover 100% because the people that were working on my team knew they had a voice, knew they could be heard, and I didn't give them everything they wanted. If I could, I would if it made sense. And if I couldn't, I at least gave them the courtesy of a response explaining why. But it made all the difference in the world. People would light up, and you don't have to. This is what I would challenge anybody listening to this to do. You don't have to be Dr. Phil. You can literally just ask the open-ended question. The other thing is notice things. If they tell you, "Oh man, I'm tired. My kid had a ball game last night." "Oh, really? How'd they do? What position do they play?" All of these little things become deposits in that emotional relationship that you have with your team. And I talk about this a lot in the client journey as well, that it works just the same with your team members. Every relationship in life has an emotional bank account, and you make deposits and you make withdrawals. And we all know what happens if you take more out of an account than you've deposited, you end up overdrawn. And too many times we're willing to withdraw, but we're not willing to deposit. And if you deposit, I can promise you, it's gonna you're using the
So on
financial
that point,
mechanism, it's
David,
gonna
on
grow
that
interest.
point, boy, you couldn't have scripted that better to bridge to this next point. And that is that I've been asked several times. I remember a client asking me, Bernie, these 10 steps to fulfillment-centric leadership, this sounds costly. And they weren't referring to dollar costs as much as time, the time that it takes to implement this framework, get the leaders engaged to actually embrace it and then act on it. And I said, my answer was, well, respectfully, I think that's the wrong question. It's not how costly it is. It's what's the opportunity cost when you don't lead your people to be both personally and professionally fulfilled?
Mm.
And your story is a testimony to that. When you lose people, when you have turnover, that cost is far greater than the cost, I'm using air quotes, the cost of implementing a framework. Notice I keep calling it a framework because it is a framework. You layer on top of it a lot of things that are unique to an organization, but the framework then enables you to lead your people authentically through this lens of fulfillment. And again, better engagement and higher retention. So you're not dealing with the turnover that you just explained. Turnover is a huge cost to any business, any business. So thank you for reminding me of that.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is, as leaders, we should be charged to develop leaders, and recognize the potential of people who have the ability to do that. And, sometimes it's masked, sometimes it's disguised, but it's actually really easy to see because all you have to do is find out, are other people following this person? I mean, and the example that I always give about this is a guy that when I had moved from actual grocery stores to super targets, that we had an issue with, and management had an issue with him. They told me when I took that position that I was going to have an issue with him, so I went in probably, humanly, and had preconceived notions as to what to expect. But what I noticed was, yeah, this guy had some pretty negative behavior, but he also had a whole ton of people that were being influenced by that negative behavior because they followed what he did. And part of the issue was that he was late for work every single night by like 15, 20 minutes. And so after about 2 or 3 weeks of dealing with it, I pulled him into my office and I said, "Hey, I got a question for you. What's going on? I mean, you know what time the shift starts. You're consistently late 15 or 20 minutes. You understand I can't tolerate that. And I know that you have had a long list of people that have beaten you down in the past, but tell me, there has to be a reason. It can't just be that you're that belligerent. Why are you late every night?" He goes, "Same, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told everybody else and the same thing I put on my job application. They gave me a job that I told them I was available starting at 11:30 at night instead of 11, but they continue to schedule me at 11 and think because they did that I can get here. I can't. I live at home with my wife and my kids. She works a 3 to 11 job. By the time she gets home and she's able to take care of the kids, and for me to leave, I literally go as fast as I can to get here when I can." He goes, "I feel like I'm doing everything I can and I just can't make anybody happy." And I said, "So what you're telling me is that if I can make your schedule start at 11:30 instead of 11 o'clock, you'll have no problem getting here at 11:30. He goes, "Yeah, I wouldn't have any problem with it at all." I said, "Done." And he said, "Are you serious?" And I said, "I'm absolutely serious. I don't understand why this is a tough problem to fix." And he said, "Man," he said, "Okay, thank you." And so guess what? We changed his schedule to 11:30. He was never late again. What ended up happening was I gave him about 2 or 3 months of me watching him and seeing, and the productivity went up. The other people followed as his productivity went up. He was happy to come to work every night. And I pulled him in one day and I said, I got to tell you, man, I'm really proud of you. I said, not that you really have done anything differently other than you came in with an open mind. You allowed me to solve a problem instead of assuming that I wouldn't. And I noticed it in your productivity. I said, but more importantly than that, you have a lot of potential, man. I don't know if you know this or not, but there are a lot of people who follow what you do. And part of the reason why I wanted to solve your problem was selfish, because I need everybody to be rowing the boat in the same direction. And when you would come in late, you would come in 15, 20 minutes into the shift, you'd disrupt everybody. They love you. They'd want to catch up on how your day had been, from the day before and everything else. And we lost a ton of time in getting things done we needed to get done. Once you started coming in on time, you were showing up with a smile on your face, ready to work, ready to do the things you needed to do. And guess what happened? Everybody else joined you. I said, so I have to ask you, I know you're probably going to be surprised by this question, but have you ever thought about going into leadership in the organization? Because I think you would be a great candidate for me to get you into a management training program and hopefully get you into a department head position at some point so you can lead that small team and then grow your career. Guess what? Over 20 years later, he still works for that company, making over $250,000 a year as a district manager. And they were ready to fire him.
Yeah. So again, David, you have been leading through the lens of fulfillment, whether you use that word or not. And all I'm doing is putting a label to it. I'm just putting a label to it so that there can be this increased awareness of how to put a dent in this 77% of the global workforce is disengaged. You clearly have been doing this for decades without using the word fulfillment, but principally speaking, you've been doing those things that get you to the same place, right? And so my framework is just a way for organizations to get to that same place, whether they do it specifically using the 10 steps that I've outlined, or they break it down to 5 steps, or they have a bunch of unconscious competent leaders, which, by the way, let me speak to that for a moment, David, because unconscious competent leaders are great. The problem is that it doesn't scale. You can't build an organization full of unconscious competent leaders because you're depending on their individual personalities. You have a God-given gift to lead that way. Not everyone has that. So you've got to provide training and education and again, what I call a framework, so that you can get to 80, 90% of people doing it, relatively the same way to get to the same outcome.
Well, I think you could go into a whole different podcast on the relationship pillar and spiritual gifts and how to maximize those and other things that would also, lead ultimately to fulfillment, but we don't have time to do that today. So I'm gonna have to have you come back. Listen, before we wrap up, how can people find more information? How can they learn more about what you're doing and be able to engage with you directly?
Sure. Thank you for asking, David. So my website is midlifefulfilled.com. So I've got everything there. And for anybody who's active on LinkedIn, Bernie Borges, Borges. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn, but really all the information that is relative to this conversation is at midlifefulfilled.com. And thank you, David, for having me back for the Power Producers podcast. I love what you're doing.
Absolutely, man. It's always my pleasure. And we'll make sure that we have all of the links and everything you need to know about Bernie in the show notes when we push this out. And you will also be able to get some good video clips. And so you can see this guy who literally has not aged a day in the 20 years that I've known him. He looks exactly the same today as he did 20 years ago. I am not kidding when I say that. So just always a pleasure, Bernie. Glad to catch up with you. Look forward to dropping this episode. But more importantly, I'm looking forward to the impact that you're going to have on people, human beings, and companies across the country, because I think you're onto something here that's really important. And as always, I'm going to be one of your biggest cheerleaders and biggest fans, and I wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you, David. Very much appreciated.
All right, everybody. We'll catch you next time. See ya.